Now, and Trent, please take it away, and thank you for all you've done.
Yeah, thanks, Doug and Dennis, and thanks everybody for taking some time out of your afternoon to hear about the things that are going on and kind of what we're looking at. As Doug mentioned, there's a lot to get through, but we'll get through it all here in the hour. So we'll get through some housekeeping stuff first here. So this is this webinar has been going on for a while now. It's a collaboration activity between the USDA climate hubs, the state climatologists, Midwest and High Plains Regional Climate Centers, NOAA National Weather Service, and the National Drought Mitigation Center. You can access all of the past and future climate webinars at those two links there through the Midwestern and High Plains Regional Climate Centers. And just a shout out, the next Climate Drought Outlook webinar is on August 17th. That is given by Pete Boulay from Minnesota, the state climate office there. All right. So an outline, I usually hate outlines and presentations, but because this one is so extensive, we're gonna give one. So we're gonna give some climate conditions, what happened in June, last 30, 60, 90 days, do some event analysis, some drought, what that meant for ag, water, fire, severe weather. There was a derecho, some tornadoes, lots of tornadoes, and actually lots of hail too, some flooding, and then air quality and wildfires. And then let's do some outlooks here for the next 2 to 4 weeks, talk about El Nino, the rest of summer, fall, and then lots of good questions at the end. All right, so we're going to kick off here with recent climate conditions. This picture is really interesting. I'll talk about the hail issues out in the Western Plains, this one at Red Rocks there in Colorado and the remnants of that. Okay, so June in general, these two maps, the one on the left is showing your statewide average temperature ranking for June of this year, and then the top right one is your precipitation ranking. So, for the left map, the higher the numbers, the darker the red, that means the warmer June was compared to other years, and the opposite with the blue. And on the right, the map of precipitation, the higher the numbers, the darker the green, that's wetter for June, and then the brownish colors are drier. So overall for temperature, we were warmer to the northwest, cooler southeast. That really followed the overall atmospheric pattern. Lots of little cutoff lows that happen in the keep a lot of the southeast cooler. Top 5 warmest June in North Dakota and in Minnesota. And when we look at the precipitation rankings, we see that also kind of a little bit of a wet to dry dipole. So wet out west, top 5 wettest June on record in Wyoming and Colorado, and then dry, especially Great Lakes and kind of central Corn Belt there. Top 5 driest June in Wisconsin and Michigan, top 10 driest June in Missouri and Illinois. And so, as we could imagine, as I'll get to the drought patterns here in a second, these really followed suit with that as well. The thing about June is that it added to a lot of places here in the Midwest. It added to deficits in precipitation that we had building up since April. And if you live in Missouri, building up even before then. So when we take April, May, and June together, this map on the left is showing your precipitation ranks for that 3-month period, April through June of this year. And those numbers, so in the top 10 driest April to June on record in Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana. And we had some long-running stations in places like Missouri and Illinois where it was actually the driest or the second driest April to June on record. So a lot of the drought we talk about was, this is a point I'm going to hit on multiple times in this talk, different than other past big drought years we've had in this region that were hot, and this time, the drought was really because it was just so dry for that 3-month period of time. The figure on the right-hand side is from Pete at Minnesota's climate office, and it shows that, the mid-May to through mid-June period of time in different cities there in Minnesota compared to kind of average in your previous low. So, for example, the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul got almost right around 1/4 of an inch of rain between mid-May and mid-June. Compared to about 5.5 inches on average. So that's really, really low. And actually it was a third of the previous low record back in 1988 there in the Twin Cities. So, many places in Minnesota were record driest or close record driest from mid-May to mid-June, just kind of, again, representing how dry that period was. On the flip side, though, don't want to ignore what happened in Wyoming and Colorado. A large part of eastern Colorado was actually the wettest on record in May, June. And as Becky Bollinger there in the Colorado State Climate Office mentioned the other day, that is the wettest time usually climatologically in Colorado. And so that May to June was actually the wettest 2 month on record for any time of the year there in Colorado. So again, that big dipole with storms in May, June, really running up the eastern slope of the Rockies and just staying dry here in the Midwest. Your 90-day precipitation, that's what these maps are showing here. The left is total precipitation and the right is your departure from normal. So, it's interesting, a lot of times when we look at these maps, we'll see that if everybody is dry, then the Midwest is still getting more rain than the plains. But in this case, the left map shows that even when you look at total precipitation, the typically drier climate of the Western Plains is actually much wetter than the Midwest was over the last 90 days. And the departures there on the map on the right-hand side, that's really indicating how far we've fallen behind in a large part of the Midwest. You can see there the darker red colors in parts of Wisconsin and Missouri. Those are areas that are 9 to 12 inches drier than normal really since mid-April. So again, just accentuating this pattern of wet out to the west and drier over this longer 90-day period to the east. I also want to mention here that these maps include most of the really heavy rainfall that fell in western Kentucky and southern Illinois. You could just yesterday, up to 12 inches in some places, and what you can see there is that still in those areas we're still a little bit behind normal, or behind the average as far as precipitation over the last 90 days. So, this is it is important to note that this is, April to June is typically one of if not the wettest times of the year for much of the eastern part of the region. But importantly, we still get rain in late July and August. It's not one of these climates where if you miss it in May and June, it doesn't come at all. So that's just an important point. And really, we've seen that in the last month or so too. So the picture from the last 90 days was very dry in the Midwest, very wet in parts of Colorado and Kansas, up in the Dakotas. The last 30 days has been a bit more variable. We've still stayed pretty wet here. The map on the left is total precipitation over the last 30 days, and then the map on the right is departure from normal over that 30-day period. So we're still wet in much of the western half of the region, but we've also brought in some more storms, wetter conditions into parts of Iowa, Illinois, and Michigan. We'll talk about what that's meant or maybe hasn't meant for drought recovery in those regions here in a second. But you can see here, especially with the departure from normal map on the right-hand side, there's still large chunks of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and then poor Missouri, that just hasn't been able to get as consistent rain as some of the other places. And you can also see on the map on the right-hand side parts of Kentucky that have had a bit too much rain, which is a pretty big understatement for some places there. And so, the picture here is, the last 90 days have been very dry. We definitely had a pretty significant drought. We've seen some improvement in the last 30 days, but more rain definitely is needed. And there are, big chunks of the region that have been missed by the recent wetter conditions. Now, switching to temperature, important point to be made here. So this is temperature over the last 30 days as a departure from normal. The left map shows this year, and then the right map is in 2012, and I'm going to get to that in a second. Look at the left map here. This year, what we see is that really the western 2/3 of the region, excluding much of Missouri, has been anywhere between 1 and up to 5 degrees below normal. We've just seen that consistent northerly or northeasterly flow, meaning the wind is coming out of the north, moving to the south. Fairly rare in the summertime, but we've had it really predominant this summer so far, so it's kept us nice and cool. When you move, further to the east, we're a little bit less of an anomaly, but it's still generally cooler than normal. Really only parts of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Missouri, those very driest places where we have that soil moisture feedback, that have been more than 1 degree warmer than normal since mid-June. But otherwise, when we look at the region as a whole, it's been near to cooler than normal for at least the first half of summer. Now, importantly, a lot of the region, especially the eastern part or kind of central part of the region, has been drier over the last 90 days, going back to April 1st, than we were in 2012. But the drought is nowhere near as extensive or as impactful region-wide as what we had in 2012. And one of the main reasons is that the temperatures have just been, as I mentioned, fairly mild compared to the same period in 2012, which is the map on the right-hand side, when the entire region was 2 to 5 degrees warmer than normal. By this time in the summer, Champaign, where I'm at now here in East Central Illinois, already had a double-digit number of 100-degree days, and we've only cracked 90 degrees about 5 times this year. So it gives you an idea of what that kind of double whammy of lack of precipitation and the temperature impact that we have in drought, like years like 2012, 1988. We've definitely had the precipitation deficits this year, but we haven't had that impact from the temperatures. So, you know, one of the good news, right, about the cooler weather has been where there has been drought. It hasn't been as bad maybe as it could have been. The downside of some of those cooler conditions, especially in the eastern part of the region, is that our crop progress has been a bit slowed from that. So the map on the right-hand side here is showing growing degree days, is modified growing degree days, which is really just an indication of the temperature effects on crop progress. And what you can see on the map, those areas in blue and kind of getting to the purplish colors from eastern Illinois eastward, those are areas where we've seen 50 to maybe up to 200 growing degree days below normal, which is pretty significant. The plot here on the bottom, this is showing from the useful to usable program, their corn growing degree day tool. And I just took an example from Delaware County, Indiana. They're kind of in east central Indiana. And the red line here is showing 2023 growing degree day units so far compared to the average, which is kind of the bluish purplish color line there. And you can see overall that it's not a record low growing degree days like some of the very, very cool summers we saw, you know, 35 years ago or so, but it's definitely running below normal. And I'll show here in a little bit the crop progress maps, and we'll definitely see that for the eastern maybe third of the region, some of that crop progress has been slowed a little bit by the lack of heat. So again, you know, you take a little, you give a little with the lack of heat so far this summer. It hasn't really made drought any worse than what it could have been, but we've slowed crop progress in some parts of the region. Okay, now pivoting a little bit to drought and hydrology conditions, and this is a big thing, kind of where we're at. And I always say, you know, coming out of drought, if that's kind of what we're doing in some places, is always messier than going into drought because we never get, we very rarely get kind of full scale widespread improvement all the time. It's usually these pop-ups, showers that help some folks and not others. So the complexity is in the drought monitor map, which is shown here. This one was released today, current as of July 18th. So very important. Those areas of southern Illinois, western Kentucky, and southeast Missouri that have just been dumped on over the last 2 days, that information is not included in the drought monitor map. So that's just important to note. More broad scale here, we still see, we've definitely seen some improvement, and I'll show the change maps here in a second. But you know, nearly 40% of the region is in at least moderate drought in this most recent version. About 16% is in at least severe drought. We still have some extreme and exceptional drought in parts of Wisconsin, Michigan, or excuse me, Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska. A little bit in Minnesota as well. What we've seen really over the last 2 to 3 weeks since the end of June has been some recent improvement in kind of the central region, especially parts of Iowa, Illinois, some of the Dakotas. But we've also seen some drought persistence farther to the north in places like Minnesota, Wisconsin, where they've stayed dry. And then again, I've mentioned Missouri before. Southern Missouri got a little bit more rain, but that central region where you're seeing those real dark red colors, that area has been very, very dry persistently. So it's a mixed bag. Some improvement recently and some drought persistence. And even in the regions where we have improved, parts of Iowa and Illinois, we still see drought there. Just because we racked up some big deficits since April. So even with those, the recent, 3, 4, 5 inches of rain in some places, we're still seeing some drought impacts, both in agriculture and in hydrology, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. Now I show the change maps. These maps here are showing the change in the drought monitor status. The left one since May 23rd, so our kind of 8-week period. And then the right one since January 24th, so kind of a 16-week period or so. And we see both patterns here, green out west, indicating widespread improvement in the last, several months, and certainly since the beginning of the year. It may be hard to remember for folks who don't live there, but out in western Kansas, they were dealing with exceptional drought coming into the new year. And a lot of that area has seen a 3 to 4, in some cases 5 category improvement in the drought monitor over that period. From those just really heavy rains like what we talked about earlier. On the flip side, the Midwest, parts of Missouri, Wisconsin, Illinois saw a 2 to 3 category, in some cases up to 4 category degradation or worsening of drought conditions since January. And really, I mean, since late May, we think about since Memorial Day, really, parts of Wisconsin, Illinois, Missouri, Minnesota have gone downhill about 3 to 4 drought classes. And that's including the recent improvement, as slight as they are. So, we talk about rapid onset drought or flash drought, and often that's something that is thought of as a combination of below normal precipitation and the really elevated temperatures that kind of combine, like what we talked about before, what we saw in 2012, for example. This year, seeing this kind of decline in drought conditions this quickly, since basically between Memorial Day and the 4th of July, that could be, by a lot of definitions, considered a flash drought. But the thing is, it was really just because it didn't rain very much. We had the precipitation deficit, as I mentioned before. We didn't have the heat adding to that, and so it just kind of reflects on how quickly we can onset drought when that precipitation, that lack of precipitation, is poorly timed. All right, so talking a little bit about evaporative demand. So thinking about the thirst of the atmosphere, we have seen, I mentioned the temperatures have been, near normal. We have seen above average evaporative demand, meaning that, the atmosphere is kind of demanding more evaporation from our soils and our plants, especially in the central Midwest. The map on the top right is your evaporative demand drought index, or EDDI, a few days ago. And the browner, redder colors across the central Midwest up into Canada, those are indicating above average evaporative demand going all the way back to mid-June. And then we see the lighter blue colors in the West indicating that the evaporative demand of the atmosphere hasn't quite been as high. Just to make a point here, we talk about the impact of temperature on evaporation, which is really important. That's the main driving variable of how much evaporation is taking place, but also humidity matters too. So even if we have lower temperatures but very low humidity, we can still have that demand for evaporation. So one of the best variables for representing that complicated relationship is something called vapor pressure deficit, which is just giving us basically how much humidity there is in the air versus how much there could be at the temperature we're at. And so we take the average, in this case, the plot on the bottom left is taking the average vapor pressure deficit since June 1st over the whole region. And what you see here is 2023 is something like the 4th highest vapor pressure deficit since 1979. The highest meaning there's high evaporative demand there. And a lot of that's humidity driven, because like I mentioned, the temperatures weren't all that high. So yeah, we have had a decent amount of evaporative demand or evaporation this year that probably has at least added to drought a little bit, but it pales in comparison to the 2 years we hold up, the two sort of middle fingers to us here in this plot, the 1988 and 2012 droughts, when our vapor pressure deficits were just through the roof. And so demand since June, that evaporation is well above average, yes, but it's much, much lower than it was in 88 and 2012. So again, what we've experienced this year so far as drought is mainly a precipitation kind of driven drought that's just been added to a little bit by the lack of humidity. Okay, so getting more into what this means, the nuts and bolts of drought kind of impacts here. Looking at soil moisture first, just a big shout out to Bryce Beerson, their intern with the USDA, and Dennis Toddy's shop. The maps here that I'm going to be showing for topsoil here, but then also crop progress, she put those together on short notice. So huge shout out to her. Definitely a big help in these talks. The map on the left is showing the percent short to very short, the top in each state for topsoil moisture. Top number is the actual percent, bottom number is the change since last week. And you can see, even again, given some improvement, we still see 75% of soils as surveyed in Missouri are short to very short as far as topsoil moisture is concerned. Some improvement you can see in Iowa, down to 43%, but still, a big chunk. So again, this painting the picture of, we have seen some improvement in parts of the region, not in everywhere, but in parts of the region, but we're still having those deficits. And so, when we think about from now to the end of the growing season, we'd love to just rely on the soil moisture we have. make it through without any additional rain, but a lot of places don't really have that moisture to do that. The map on the right is from the NLDAS, which is a kind of a model system for soil moisture, so not observations, but models. And it generally lines up with what we see. This is just a 1 meter percentile, meaning it's, the drier, the lower the numbers, the darker the reds, the drier the soils, and the flip side for blues. So it generally paints the same pattern here, where kind of the central Midwest has been fairly dry. You can see the big dryness in parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin and Missouri. Out west, it's a bit wetter. And then although parts of Indiana and Ohio had been in pretty significant drought, they've slightly to somewhat improved since then. Moving to stream conditions. So on the map on the right-hand side, this is our 14-day stream flow that's categorized by watershed. So instead of showing a bunch of individual points, we're showing kind of the watersheds here, and where we're in drought, or where we have well below normal stream flow, or maybe above normal stream flow. The blues are where we have, or the greens and blues are near normal to above normal flow in those streams, and then the oranges and reds are below normal. So again, it just reinforcing the point here that our drought has actually rather quickly progressed to hydrological drought in a lot of places like Missouri, parts of Iowa and Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And again, when we talk about stream flow or hydrological drought, it's not as simple as getting an inch of rain. Yeah, the crops may really appreciate that, but it's going to take a lot more to get your streams going, because you're losing that base flow from the groundwater. We do see that when you get 12 inches of rain, some of the streams like in western Kentucky do respond to that, and I'll show how the response to the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers here in a second on that. But in general, what this is indicating is, even in the areas we've seen some improvement, like parts of Illinois and Iowa recently in drought, we still see those below normal flows in some of these streams. So what it does, it takes a consistent, near to above normal rainfall for weeks to really get that stream flow going. All right, so talking about our major rivers, going to break it down here between the Missouri, the Mississippi, and the Ohio. So the Missouri River, gosh, in recent years, I feel like all the focus is on the Missouri River because it was our problem river. And this year has not been the case. We have near average snowmelt this year, plus a good amount of rain, unexpectedly large amount of rain in some of the kind of the upper watersheds of the Missouri. And so, even though it's still below full service, we're looking good as far as the Missouri River is concerned, expecting full 8-month navigation season. And even the releases from Gavin's Point, below to Gavin's Point, is lower than forecasted. So things are looking pretty good along the Missouri. For the Mississippi River, the Ohio has been the saving grace. If you think back to that stream flow map that I just showed you, a lot of the worst flow or the lower flows in the upper Mississippi River basin and parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin, and so that has caused the mid to lower Mississippi to kind of fall toward that low stage. But the flow has been maintained, at least kind of just hanging on, thanks to better rain in the Ohio Valley. However, I do want to make the point, I'll make this again in the summary towards the end, that even though we've remained above low flow or low stage on the Mississippi south of Cairo, the concerns still remain, because we still are a ways away from what is typically the lowest point on the river. Thinking about kind of September, October, that's when we typically have kind of the lowest stage in the rivers before the winter recharge begins. You can see here the bottom right plot here. This is a combination of observation of the stage on the Mississippi River at Memphis, and then the kind of purplish squares beyond that dashed line. That's our forecast, and so you can see that, moving out till the last few days, we saw the Mississippi at Memphis begin to dip towards that low stage, and that the kind of forecasted spike is that big rush of water from Ohio from Kentucky and Illinois, that we received that really big heavy rain the last few days. But you can see also beyond that, the forecast again begins to dip. So, the flow from the Ohio has been good for the lower Mississippi, but again, the concerns over low flow remain. The Ohio in particular, though, we've had better flow from rain in Ohio and Kentucky. That recent really heavy rain in Illinois and Kentucky bumped up the flow forecast. You can see in the top right plot, that's the Ohio River, both observations and forecast levels at Cairo. and you can see that big bump from 18 to 21 feet. That's that really intense rainfall, those floodwaters coming out of western Kentucky. But again, you can the forecast gentling, kind of rolling out towards low stage as we get into August. So, you know, again, the overarching message here for the Mississippi and to a lesser extent the Ohio is that we're okay for now. The recent rains have been a big help, but we need more consistent rains, especially in the upper Mississippi Valley and the lower Ohio Valley, to continue to stretch out to stay away from that kind of low flow stage. All right, switching a little bit to wildfires. Now I'm going to talk about Canadian sourced wildfires in a little bit when we talk about air quality, but these are local sourced wildfire issues in the region, and mainly in Minnesota and Wisconsin. So the picture here from the, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but the Waushara County in Wisconsin. There's an 830 plus acre wildfire in that county in early July, really significant. So far in Wisconsin, there's been over 4,400 acres of the DNR managed land burned, let alone, you know, whatever private land's been burned so far this year. And that compares to less than 700 acres in all of 2022. So more than 5 times, or actually more than 6 times the acres burned so far this year related to just dry fuels from the drought. Similar 225 acres burned in northern Michigan in July from a pretty significant fire up there. Now, the recent rain in the upper Midwest has helped a little bit. The fuel and fire behavior advisory that was mentioned in last month's webinar was rescinded in July, so that's a good step forward, improvement. But as I mentioned before, a lot of these areas of Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, northern Michigan haven't been as wet as places farther south in recent days, recent weeks. So, you know, the concern still is there about wildfire, especially as we move into what is, again, climatologically some of the drier fuel times, which is kind of late summer, early fall. So much like a lot of the kind of messages from this webinar is that the fire concern has been tamped down a little bit in these regions, but it's still there because we definitely just need more consistent rain from now really through October to really come out of that. And I also want to mention here, you know, conditions have improved significantly in Kansas, but just want to mention that Kansas had the disaster declarations from a big fire in Ford County there, no relation, that was earlier in May or June there from the Kansas fires. All right, so now I'm staying with the topic of fire here just to kind of keep everybody's attention focused on that and looking at the outlooks. So these are the significant wildland fire potential outlooks from NIFC. And the areas in red are areas where there's an above normal wildland fire potential. From left to right, we're looking at August, September, and October. And so again, these are outlooks. These aren't necessarily forecasts, but generally outlooks for these areas. And what you can see is kind of what we talked about. Given the recent rain and the outlooks for you know, kind of what we're seeing in the next couple of weeks to months, we still have that above normal wildland fire potential in much of the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes that really extends into September as well as August. And so this is something that, you know, what we really need here is just more consistent rains for these parts of especially Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan to really tamp down on that fire concern again as we move towards the time period when we typically have the driest and most abundant fuels anyway. All right, I want to hit on Great Lakes just for a second here. No big problems here. As far as lake temperatures, Superior is running, you know, a little bit below average as far as water lake temperature is concerned. All the other lakes are within a degree of average. Lake levels, you know, as for typical, lake levels plateaued in May. The Michigan Huron Basin levels are slightly below normal, but nothing of concern. And all the other lakes are very close or slightly above normal levels. So, you know, with all the other things going on in the region, it's kind of nice to look to the lakes and say, okay, we're looking okay, at least for there. All right, so let's transition to impacts and sort of notable events, all the notable events that happen across the region. I just want to stop for a second here to look at this beautiful picture of the best city in the region from Barry Butler there, and the magnificent clouds that were over the city of Chicago just a few weeks ago. All right, so let's start with agricultural impacts here. Drought is the one of note here that we start with. We've seen drought stress in corn and beans across the Midwest. Some examples of that: stunted corn, short tasseling from that stunting, and we're seeing it here in Illinois and Missouri and elsewhere. The big question is yield loss from that, and I think on one hand, there was some really stressed conditions out there and still out there in a lot of places that haven't gotten the improvement. But recent rains were pretty well timed with kind of the early stages of pollination, of tasseling, and if we can catch those consistent rains, then I think that in general the region could end up being pretty good. But again, it's quite variable depending on who caught the rain and who didn't. Recent rains have improved the conditions in a lot of places, but not everywhere. So more rain is definitely needed across these growing areas. When we think about beans in particular, that's always thought of one of those August kind of make or break. And so, as I mentioned, kind of living off soil moisture may not be enough in a lot of these drier places. So we really do need those rains to manifest in later this month and into August. As I mentioned before, the lack of heat has greatly helped crops manage the drought. I don't want to think about where we would have been if we had 2012-like heat this year in parts of Illinois and Missouri and Iowa. But of course, on the flip side, it did delay progress in Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky. That really, only becomes that issue when we start getting into harvest and seeing, if we get good harvest weather, there won't be really any kind of issues with that. Livestock problems in Missouri especially, but elsewhere. I would argue that this drought has had the largest impact so far on pasture conditions. Really poor pasture regrowth in a lot of Missouri and parts of Illinois and elsewhere after the first, or if people could even make a second cutting of hay in some places. Very low or unusable stock ponds, lots of water hauling taking place across places like Missouri. And then also you get concerns over water quality, hearing that in North Dakota with the cyanobacteria. This is sort of one of these things where it's not just the drought we're dealing with right now, but the legacy of last year's drought. If you remember, last fall was very, very dry. We had the low flow concerns on the Mississippi last fall, and hay stocks, people either dipped into their hay stocks really early in the fall, as what happened in a lot of places in southern Illinois, for example, or they didn't get that kind of good cutting later in the season. So hay stocks in general that kind of are limited, and it's making the current situation worse for feeding. So that is a problem that we're seeing. On the flip side, I have a picture down below of what looks like a nice pastoral scene across a nice hayfield in Wyoming, except this isn't a hayfield, it's a wheat field. Folks are baling wheat in Wyoming, in some places Wyoming, because it was so wet this early summer that they had significant volunteer rye growth that just made it hard to get the quality of wheat going, and so it forced some producers to bale wheat in Wyoming. We've seen some issues with drought and other things with specialty crops, fruit and vegetable crops. In general, in the places where we have had drought, it's been pretty consistent that rain-fed fruit and vegetable crops have struggled. We've seen some just strawberry growers who aren't irrigated just completely giving up on their crop in places like Minnesota and Illinois. But the irrigated crops are doing well. So if you have that supplemental water source for irrigation, in general, the fruit and vegetable crops have done pretty good. And especially the case because our nighttime temperatures have been pretty low, the humidity's been low, so the disease pressure in general so far has been a bit less, as well as the insect pressure. We've also seen a lot of hail activity out west in parts of Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, and so there's been some above normal hail damage in the western parts of the region to crops as well. So that's something we've been dealing with. Speaking of crops in particular, I want to get into the crop conditions. This is for corn. Again, shout out to Bryce for making these maps. The map on the left is the percent good to excellent, most recent report from USDA, and then the report on the right is percent poor to very poor. So we see slight improvement in corn conditions across the region relative to last week. And that's especially the case in in Indiana and Ohio. Where they've been able to catch those good rains. However, despite the improvement, Missouri and Illinois still have greater than 20% of their corn conditions poor to very poor. Missouri is up to 33%. and a lot of that is on the lighter soils that just haven't been able to hang on to the water as much, or we're seeing the timing of planting really come into this, at least in Illinois, where the later planted stuff, I mean, in some cases, the late planted stuff didn't have any rain from planting all the way to the end of June, just because of how dry June was. And so that's really taken a toll on some of those acres. However, region-wide and over some of the critical growing areas, we've seen some improvements recently from the more recent rain. For soybeans, similar, kind of a similar improvement from last week. Again, left map percent good excellent, right map poor to very poor. And the late planted beans, you know, where we're seeing 28% poor to very poor in Missouri, 22% in Illinois. Those late planted beans, we're still struggling in a lot of places. You know, driving around parts of Western Illinois and Eastern Missouri, seeing beans just a couple weeks ago that were still only maybe 3 or 4 inches tall. Those late planted beans that just haven't gotten enough water in there. But again, you know, recent rains have helped. That's been great. We get that soil moisture, bank it in for if it does turn dry. But again, the real time to make or break beans is late July to August. So even though we've gotten recent good rains, we really want those to continue through at least the next several weeks. Crop progress, this is what I wanted to point to when we talked about the difference in temperatures and growing degree days between the West and the East. So on the left is the percent silking corn relative to the 5-year average, which is in the parentheses there. And then the right is the soybeans percent setting pod. I think the silking really shows it more than anything. I mean, we are way ahead of the 5-year average as far as the percent of corn that's silking in Illinois and Missouri in particular. 15% ahead of normal in Missouri, for example. And I think a lot of what helped with that is just April dryness. We had a very pleasant and dry April that really helped for planting conditions. And when we look at further east, though, places like Ohio, to a lesser extent, Indiana and Kentucky, we're still seeing below average, corn and soybean progress. That's that effect of having those maybe some issues with planting, but then also lower growing degree days in that part of the region. And so that's something that we're seeing, again, that kind of east-west divide there. And then I just want to throw this in here just because I mentioned the pasture conditions here. Pasture has been one of those big impacts from drought, and we're seeing 72% of our pasture conditions are poor to very poor in Missouri, 43% in Illinois, and despite the rain in parts of, for example, Illinois and Wisconsin, we're still seeing those numbers tick up. And that's one of the big things about pasture, of course, is the response of pasture to rain is not like it is in corn and beans. It doesn't just turn a switch and turns on green. So recent rains have helped some of the regrowth, but this is really a longer term issue for pasture. One thing I've been hearing from folks in Illinois and Kentucky too is these cool wet springs we've had recently and the dry kind of late summer and fall like what we had last year. It's really been challenging for pastures. So it exacerbates, I mentioned the hay stock situation, but it exacerbates kind of summer drought conditions that we have when it comes to pasture conditions, having those less than ideal quality in the fall. Getting beyond drought and crop conditions, just want to talk about other significant weather impacts because there's been a lot of them over the last couple of months. On June 29th, June 30th, we had a derecho, really strong windstorm in Illinois and Indiana. Lots of trees. There was some crop damage, but it was pretty minimal compared to what we had a couple years ago in Iowa, for example, from that derecho. But a lot of tree damage, power lines down, $20 million estimated in damage in Springfield alone from that storm. And there were thousands of people in Illinois and Indiana that were out of power for 7 to 10 days. I mean, it was a long time there. So it's a pretty significant storm there. You may have seen on the news, we had a hailstorm in Red Rocks, the concert, outdoor concert theater there in Colorado on June 22nd. I showed a picture of that earlier, and 7 people were hospitalized from that. That was a pretty significant event. Severe weather across northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin on July 13th. We had 11 tornadoes in the Chicagoland area and had a temporary shutdown of O'Hare Airport. Maybe some of you were stuck there in the bottom layer of the airport as it got shut down. That was pretty significant. And in general, I want to talk about for a second about tornadoes. You know, in some parts of the region, like the Dakotas, we've had well below normal tornado activity, and that's just because Illinois has sucked up all the tornadoes, pun intended. So far we've had here in Illinois 119 tornadoes this year, which if this year ended now, it would still be the third most active year. We have a ways to go and to beat the 2006 record of 142, and I hope we don't get there, but it's just been very active across that kind of central part of the region as far as tornado activity is concerned. Colorado has had their fair share of tornadoes and then some. They had 36 tornadoes just on June 21st, which is probably the one of, if not the highest single day total on record there. And Colorado has also had a lot of hail. The governor issued a disaster declaration from hail damage there this month. In June, they had an estimated, that's a big asterisk there, but an estimated 310 June reports of hail, which would be by far the most there on record. You know, we had to add in some of these points just yesterday. We had very heavy rain and flooding in parts of western Kentucky and southern Illinois yesterday. Mayfield, Kentucky recorded over 11 inches of rain in less than 24 hours, which, if confirmed, would be a new 24-hour rainfall record for Kentucky. So really significant flooding there. Unfortunately, that was in Mayfield or near Mayfield, which was a town that was hit by a big EF4 tornado just a couple years ago. So really unfortunate to see that kind of flooding there. Also heavy rain in the Chicagoland area, about 8 inches in 12 hours there that flooded a lot of the west side of the city especially. And then we had a flooding-related death, unfortunately, in Colorado in June from their really heavy rainfall. I want to mention air quality problems too. So I mentioned the locally sourced wildfires. That's not what's causing the air quality problems over the last few months. The wildfire smoke that we've been getting that has been degrading our air quality and our visibility, as the photo on the bottom left from Detroit shows, that's coming from Canadian wildfires, which, you know, is not terribly unusual to get a little bit of wildfire smoke later in the season from Western Canada and the Western US. But what's really interesting, the map, the kind of map on the top left here is showing a satellite kind of rendition here of where that smoke's coming from. You can see it's coming from north to south. So a lot of the wildfire smoke that we've been inundated with in parts of the Midwest so far this year has actually come from northern and eastern Canada, from parts of Ontario and Quebec. They've had a very unusually high wildfire activity because of drought in those regions. And that northerly flow that's kept us nice and cool, kept the humidity low, has blown in some of that wildfire smoke as well. Very poor air quality from this because a lot of the particulate matter has come down to the surface. So several days where the EPA's air quality index, that's the AQI, was greater than 300 in places like Detroit and Chicago. By the way, 300 is hazardous air quality. There's an international group that keeps track of air quality in a lot of international cities, and Detroit and Chicago were on top of that list a few times in June. So really significant, you know, health impacts that can come from this. The thing is that I've been getting a lot of media requests of, oh, when is this going to end? You know, well, it's an ephemeral problem. When the wind shifts out of the north, we can get the wildfire smoke. When it comes from out of the south or southwest, it generally doesn't affect us. The problem is that the wildfire smoke is a problem until the wildfires are extinguished. So this is likely going to be a recurring problem off and on, not every single day, but off and on through the rest of the summer and into fall into much of the Midwest. Okay, so ending here with some outlooks. I have the map of the DuQuoin State Fair. We in Illinois have the unique situation of having 2 state fairs. So as we get into August, we get into state fair time, and we can see what the weather is going to look like. Starting with El Nino. So El Nino is part of the El Nino Southern Oscillation. We are in an El Nino, and it is an ocean pattern, a pattern of sea surface temperatures in the tropical Pacific that then can affect the flow of the jet stream and the atmospheric patterns that can then affect our climate. But there's connections, kind of chain links all the way through. So we have developed an El Nino. We can see that the map on the bottom left is our sea surface temperature anomalies in the tropical Pacific. Very warm anomalies here that are characteristic of the El Nino pattern off the coast of Peru. The tropical Pacific atmospheric conditions are also consistent with a weak El Nino. So this is the key, is that it's not just enough to get the El Nino pattern developed in the ocean. We need the atmosphere to respond to that ocean pattern in order to get any kind of climate feedback here in Illinois. And that may or may not have happened yet. And so even though we have a El Nino that is developed and strengthening in the ocean, we've just recently seen the atmosphere begin to respond to that. Interestingly enough, this is nothing, apropos to nothing, but the last year that El Nino actually developed in the summer, not carried through, because El Nino is typically a cool season pattern, especially when it affects our climate. The last time El Nino developed in the summer and then carried through was actually 2009. So it's not necessarily super rare, but it's also not common that we get kind of this development in the summertime. Now, from the latest CPC outlooks, there's a greater than 90% chance that El Nino persists through the winter. So it's very, very likely we're going to be in an El Nino pattern through this winter, when it does tend to have the biggest impact on our climate in general here in the region. Yeah, so that's kind of what we're looking at now with El Nino. So we're in the El Nino phase, and it's likely to carry through to the wintertime, although it's arguable whether it's really had a big impact on our climate, on our weather yet here in the Midwest and the plains. All right, so looking beyond that 7-day precipitation forecast, we get some the darker colors, the blues, the reds here, indicating some higher levels of precipitation, but pretty isolated where those are, really in eastern Colorado, western Kansas, maybe some scattered thunderstorms in the Ohio Valley and up in Michigan. But again, it's not going to bring a lot of drought relief to a wide part of the area. And if you remember back to all of my kind of musings about drought so far this presentation, we're the driest in parts of Missouri, Wisconsin, Minnesota, parts of Illinois even, and those areas are largely going to miss the heavier rains. So drier in the upper Midwest, the western Corn Belt, the Dakotas. So for right now, at least over the next week or so, it looks like we'll need to live off of the soil moisture in the places where we have it. In the places where the soils that have already missed a lot of the rains, where the soils are drier, a kind of a drier forecast, especially with the heat that is forecasted to build in, I'll get to that in a second, may induce a little bit more stress. So that heat that I talked about, here's our 8 to 10 day outlook. So this is getting beyond the next week into the second week. So this is July 27th through August 2nd. And the map on the left is our temperature outlook, big, bold area of above normal, leaning to likely above normal temperature chances here across the region. And so there's higher chances of warmer than normal as that ridge that's been kind of positioned over Texas in the southwest maybe opens up, gives us a little bit of the heat. And I'll talk about what that means here in a second. On the precipitation side of things, the map on the right-hand side, it's kind of a mixed bag. Slightly higher chances of wetter than normal conditions in the Dakotas and in the east, maybe a little bit drier in Kansas and Missouri. But you can see there the colors aren't nearly as dark, meaning the likelihoods are a bit lower. So there's kind of a mixed bag on as far as precipitation is concerned, not a really strong signal there. The big signal for week 2 is the higher temperatures. As I mentioned, the heat, this is the hazards map for week 2 from the Climate Prediction Center. And what this is showing is that for pretty much the entire region, not pretty much, the entire region, there's a moderate to slight risk of hazardous temperatures in late July and in the first few days of August. Looking at the models, likely temperatures into the 90s across the region, possibly some triple digits in some places, and something we haven't seen widespread yet this summer is the humidity building in. So it's not just temperatures in the 90s, but heat index values quite high as well. Right now, in the places especially that have been a bit wetter, this is more of a human and livestock problem. But without that soil moisture reserve in some of our driest areas, when we turn the heat on, we really get the ramping up of those crop stress and the impacts. And this isn't necessarily the best timed heat because we're really getting those critical stages of pollination in corn and even maybe getting some of the critical stages of pod setting in beans as well. So the big question, I think, is does this persist beyond week 2? If we have a few days where it's really hot and then we can get a cooler pattern established with maybe some rain, it may diminish or reduce some of the impacts. If this persists beyond week 2, we may be looking at some more problems. Looking at August, the August in general, the outlooks, the most recent outlooks from Climate Prediction Center, temperature on the left, interesting below normal precipitation, or excuse me, below normal temperatures, so cooler than normal conditions, kind of leaning that direction in that big kind of blue bullseye there between the Dakotas and kind of western Illinois. That's a very strong El Nino signal. It's kind of what CPC is leaning on a lot here. And so that's just a major point there. When we have an El Nino or La Nina condition, that's a big source of our predictability. So there's still some uncertainty there, but that's kind of what we see there. And on the right-hand side, monthly precipitation outlook, you can see kind of painted a bit wetter than normal for a lot of Missouri. Gosh, that would be great if they could get some wetter than normal conditions there, if that does set up in August, and even over to the eastern part of the Corn Belt as well. Equal chances farther west, and maybe some parts of eastern Colorado kind of shading into that below normal, higher leaning below normal precipitation for that reduced monsoon area. The seasonal outlooks, August through October, very similar pattern here, keeping cooler in the central region, a bit smaller, equal chances of above and below normal temperatures in the Dakotas and Minnesota for August through October, maybe warmer east, but again, a bit more uncertainty there. And then for the right-hand side, seasonal precipitation outlook, again, this is August through October, wetter than normal in parts of Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, but equal chances of above or below normal precipitation elsewhere. I just want to mention this real quick, because I know I'm running out of time, but as I mentioned, the CPC is really leaning on El Nino here as kicking into gear and affecting our weather with these outlooks. And what I'm showing here are composites, meaning kind of average conditions over past El Nino events when we've had it in August and October over the last 30 or 40 years or so. I put this disclaimer in here. This is not a forecast. This is just averaging over past El Nino events, and we know that every El Nino event can act a little bit differently. The temperature anomalies are on the left-hand side here. The big blue area across the whole central U.S. is indicating that in the most recent past El Nino events in August to October, we've leaned a bit cooler than normal in the region. The precipitation anomalies on the right-hand side are more of a mixed bag. Some places are wetter than normal in the Mississippi Valley, the Ohio Valley. A few places are closer to normal. But when you see that kind of big blue bullseye there in parts of the Dakotas, Iowa, Nebraska in the outlooks, some of that, not all of it, but some of it is leaning on these kind of past El Nino events have been there. But again, there's a lot of other players other than El Nino that affect our weather and climate. And so this is just one of those possible sources of predictability. The drought outlook, it follows what we would expect when we paint a lot of the central region wetter than normal in the outlooks from August through October. It would make sense then that CPC would say that a lot of this drought that's in really across much of the region would either remain and improve or is removed altogether. And so they're calling for a lot of drought improvement or removal in much of the region. Maybe some drought persistence in the northern Great Lakes. Again, we think about fire concerns. That's a big thing there. If we hang on to drought into the fall, that could increase our fire risk there. But right now, overall, given the kind of a little bit wetter or near normal outlooks for the next month to 3 months, that's what this drought outlook is leaning on there for removal or improvement across much of the area. All right, big summary here. Current conditions, just to recap, recent rains have eased the drought in a lot of places after a really dry April and June, except in Colorado, we're throwing them out. But in general, we're not out of the woods for drought. Drought remains in much of the region. Crop conditions are okay in a lot of places for now. Pastures hurting, but we can't just assume that we're good to go for the rest of the season. We need consistent rains for the rest of July and into August to really make the crop. Better conditions, crop conditions in the west, but there's been some hail out there. I would say, hey, there's good conditions out east in Indiana, Ohio, but some delays from cooler conditions. So nobody's winning, but overall things are looking okay. Big point here, this is not 2012 or 1988. Even with next week's heat, we will be nowhere near where we were this time of the year in 2012 or 1988 because we just haven't had the temperatures or demand of evaporation yet to pull that in there. So that is a big point that those are very imperfect analogies for this year as far as drought. The air quality issues from Canadian wildfires is going to be an ephemeral issue for the rest of summer and into fall. So check your EPA's air quality index. The outlooks, bit drier near term, the next week or so, plus the heat, that's likely going to induce some stress in crops and those already dry soils, especially not necessarily the best timed. But again, the question of if that persists, if it goes away after week 2, we get back to what we've been in a cooler pattern, then I think we'll be okay. Also of concern, heat stressing livestock. with those water concerns, already having to haul water, maybe having less than ideal pasture conditions, that can exacerbate some of those heat stress. And then human impacts. We don't want to look past those because those can be pretty significant as well as the region from the heat. The outlooks beyond that are leaning near normal or wetter than normal in much of the region in August. That's especially helpful for beans, but also can help finish corn if it does come to fruition. There are still going to be concerns despite that outlook. There's still concerns with fire in the northern part of the region, especially if drought persists. And as always, as we make our way towards what is typically the lowest time in a lot of our major rivers, there's still those navigation concerns in lower Mississippi. We got to get that consistent rain in August, September to kind of assuage some of those navigation concerns. All right. So last bit is, again, more housekeeping, just further information of all the partners. Big thanks to everybody who's contributed all the photos and everything for this. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Doug with my apologies that I know I blew past my time, but I'm happy to take any questions.
All right. Yeah. Leave your, thank you. First of all, leave your slide deck open in case we need to run around in there. We only have 5,000 questions. No, we have several questions. We're going to get to them really fast. Some of them were answered on the fly by our partner, Dennis Toddy, who I forgot to mention at the beginning, who is the director of the USDA Climate Hub out of Midwest Climate Hub out of Ames, Iowa. So a lot of your questions, especially on the ag side, will be answered by him. And if there's anything you want to add to that, Dennis or Trent, these questions, feel free. First question was there widespread corn and soybean damage caused by the June 28th derecho? Dennis said yes, some, not too serious. And do you want to say anything else, Trent?
No, Dennis got it. It's not nearly as widespread. From initial surveys, it's not nearly as widespread as what happened in Iowa a few years ago. There was damage, but it's expected that some of the corn that was laid over that we saw pictures of is probably standing back up. So there was damage, but not nearly as much, kind of like Dennis said.
All right.
And connect to a later question on that. The derecho back in 2020 was stronger. It was also later in the season when crops are more brittle. You knock them over, they're down. Some of the corn that was knocked down in this case is able to get itself righted and still have decent yield.
All right. Are the USDA crop condition ratings, we'll just say in the Midwest, he mentions Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, not reflecting hail and wind damage? And I think Dennis says, yes, they are, but the damage overall has not been that extensive. Unlike the western parts of this region. So we'll get to that. Are there any reports of corn and soybean disease due to the dry conditions? I think that's a double-edged sword, right? There's good and bad to that. Somebody want to comment?
Trent, you want to take any of that?
Yeah, I mean, the big impact as far as disease and pest management that I've heard about from the drought is spider mites. They tend to create some problems, especially in beans, but also in corn when it gets dry. And there was some of that, but from what I've heard, at least in Illinois, is that the recent rains have really assuaged that a lot. So I haven't really heard of any big disease problems. Lots of folks around here spraying fungicide just because we've gotten some rain now, but I haven't heard of significant disease pressure yet. So Dennis, I don't know about you.
Yeah, tar spot has popped up. A couple of other things have popped up, but Trent hit it that it rained and it got a little bit wet in places, and there's been a lot of spraying now preventatively. So the efficacy of that is somewhat in question.
But dryness helps not so that there's not as much fungus. Is that correct?
Reduces disease usually. There are some dry issues that do.
Right.
Yep.
Are there good projections of EDI, the evaporative demand index, under different greenhouse gas emissions? And there are probably not of EDI, but there are some projections of evapotranspiration for the future. That's probably something we need to go into greater detail. And Kate, if you want to know more about that, write to any of us, if you will, and we probably can find a better answer than what we can right here. Because the EDI is really made, as Dennis says, for real-time evaluation. All right. Moving on, is it true? We would only expect a mild yield loss in a D1 drought areas and moderate yield loss starting in D2 areas. That's a kind of a hard one to answer, but go ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, it's when is that D1 or D2? What part of the growing season is it? Right now is a time where you can start knocking back yield on corn and then soon on soybeans. But it also depends on what is the soil moisture situation, what is the rooting depth, and a number of other factors. So generally, the worse the drought conditions, the more yield loss there is, but it's not a linear relationship by any stretch.
Right. And so particular crops can be saved and can actually do quite well, even though there's a pretty bad drought going on. It's all about timing. Does that be correct, Dennis and Trent?
Yes.
Okay. Have recent fires / smoke impacted corn and soybeans negatively? Great question. We hear this a lot. Dennis has all the answers and Trent has all the rest.
Smoke and yield issues keep coming up because of this. There are several things at play. When you have smoke, you reduce the amount of incoming solar radiation, so that can reduce yields. It also creates more diffuse radiation or more photosynthetically active radiation, which crops can use better. So there's actually a positive. And there's actually a positive because, as Trent talked about, we've had some cool conditions, partially because we've had some less solar radiation coming in. The net may be a little negative on yield, but it is not clear cut. Trent, did I cover that?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, one other thing too is that as we mentioned, the wildfire smoke has been ephemeral. So we'll have a day or two where it's pretty thick and then it goes away for a while. So that's another thing. It's not like drought where it's constantly there. So it kind of complicates its relationship with yield. But yeah, Dennis, I think you got everything.
I did hear a comment this morning on some specialty crops where there may have been some funky things happening on certain crops. Maybe some cucumbers, and then there was something else that there's been increased levels of ozone that may have caused some issues with some specialty crops.
Maybe we'll get a unique vintage on some of the Midwest grapes.
California's had that, by the way. So because they've had plenty of smoke in their grapes. Just a comment on Idaho wildfires being really tough in the Snake River drainages. And thank you, Dennis, for that comment. He was a fighter out in Idaho for several years, late 70s into the 90s. And then I think there was another question that Dennis already answered in terms of the derecho. Moving on, much of the greater wildfire outlook for late summer, early fall, butt up against Canada in the Northwest, Great Lakes. Are there outlooks for Western and Eastern Canada and similar? So I looked this up and I put a link. If you want to go look at how the Canadians do their forecasts, you can choose the month like you can in the US. It's a nice map, but basically the end answer is August, September, July, August, September. I can't remember what I looked at now. July, August, September all have above normal risk for fire for almost the entire nation of Canada. As you get into late September, I think that starts coming south, moving south, because it just simply gets too cool. And I don't know about wet, but it starts cooling off rapidly. Why is there more hail in Nebraska and Colorado than other places? Well, sort of as you go west across the plains, especially there's a bullseye actually in Wyoming, southeast Wyoming, where hail is quite prevalent. And if you ever drive out there and look at the locals' cars, you'll notice it very quickly that most of them have hail damage. And there's a reason for that. And that is a favored region, including Nebraska, Colorado, surrounding areas, for hail and big hail and frequency of hail. I hope I said that right. And anything you want to add to that, you guys? But that kind of hail can happen anywhere. It's just very much more frequent as you go to the high plains, west of the 100th meridian. Okay. Mesonet station that recorded potential rainfall. Okay, just a comment from Kentucky saying They measured the potential rainfall record for the state in 24 hours, over 11 inches, and also briefly held the high wind gust recorded in Kentucky as well. It was dethroned about an hour later when the same tornado system hit a second mesonet station. So all kinds of records being set in Kentucky for wind and rain. How may consecutive high stress heat days, how many consecutive high stress heat days can corn and soybeans withstand without yield loss? There's a $1 billion question.
And that is also related to multiple factors. How much moisture do you have in the soil? When you are hot, is it humid? More humid conditions will reduce the crop water loss. You know, a number of factors. So basically, the longer time you are at higher temperatures, the longer or the more yield loss you're going to get. But there's not a specific answer for that.
So worst case scenario are hot, windy, dry days.
Yes.
Okay. Someone mentions that we haven't mentioned the PDO and thus some cooler and colder waters off the West Coast. What I would say about that is that the Climate Prediction Center has put this into their forecasts, and they're aware of that. The El Nino signature is really strong this year, which means a lot of warm water. And one thing that's some people sort of hypothesize is that all the warm water, not only along the equator, but in surrounding areas, which usually doesn't happen during an El Nino, is sort of dampening the connection, if you will, between that warm ocean and the atmosphere as much as it has been in the past. So, yep, indeed, there are cooler than normal temperatures off the west coast in the water, but by and large, ocean temperatures are much warmer than normal. Leaf diseases need moisture to flourish. Okay, thank you, Virgil. That's good. Anyone interested? Oh, boy. Okay, yeah. So a comment from Scott here, and he's mentioning that anybody sort of interested in impacts of drought on groundwater, the USGS maintains a user-friendly website for McHenry County, Illinois. They have a network of 37 real-time monitoring networks. Maybe the best contact for that would be Trent. If you want to contact Trent and find out more about that in Illinois, please contact him, Trent Ford, the presenter today. Stable flies are affecting cattle. From all the precip. So yeah, it's been unusually wet, and in fact wetter, which is very odd, across the high plains than portions of the Midwest, which are used to wetter conditions, and the high plains being drier, right? Especially in May and June, and so there are issues with. We've heard of grasshoppers. We've heard of now flies and other insects probably causing problems in the high plains, where they're not usually that big of as the same issue anyway. Okay, and then someone else is pointing out a good article from Purdue on smoke impacts to corn growth. I've seen a few of these different ones in extension. Let's see. Can we get copies of the slides? So yeah, Dennis and everybody else on here, basically everybody can get all the slides all the time. You can get them from your regional client. Hey, can you go to that? Can you back up one slide? All right. So at the very bottom, where is it? Is it here? No. Oh, at the very top. Sorry, at the very top, you can see two addresses to go get these in about 24 hours. They're not instantaneous. At the
Doug, that top one is wrong.
The top one's wrong. Yeah. I forgot to change it needs to be Purdue up there.
Well, okay. So at the bottom one, the HPRCCUNL.du webinar PHP is the place to get it. You can probably, why don't you change that on the fly? I think she just sent us a new email today in terms of a URL to put in there. So yeah, go ahead and change that and I'll put it up there. So yeah, anybody can get these slides anytime. And if you still can't, you can always write to one of us and we'll find it and put it in PDF form and send it to you. All right, I've lost my, I don't know what happened here. Okay, there we go. And I think we've got to the end. Yes, we got to the end. And
yeah, Doug, sorry, I put it in the wrong one. The copies of the slides, I entered the new URL from MRCC.
Okay, I think Trent got it up there too on the webinar. So
these two are the right ones. Yep.
Thank you to all of you who stayed late. We try not to do this, but sometimes we are a little overwhelmed by, by the climate. So thank you, Trent, very much. I'm going to end this here pretty quick because we all got to get going. And we'll see you all on the 17th of August. Thanks for hanging in there so long.